So it looks like maybe the declaration by United Nations was the actual beginning of the Satanic Jewish New World Order. It says the declaration by United Nations was the main treaty that formalized the allies of World War II. It says on January 1st, 1942, the Allied Big Four, right, the US, UK, and Soviet Union and China, signed a short document which later became known as the United Nations Declaration. And it says that that became the basis of the United Nations, which was signed by 50 countries in June of 1945. So over on the right there, with the top arrow, it says, having subscribed to a common program of purposes and principles embodied in the joint declaration of the President of the U.S. and the Prime Minister of Great Britain, dated August 14th, 1941, known as the Atlantic Charter, right? So that's what all the governments agreed to. So Churchill and FDR came up with, I guess, the foundation of the Declaration of the United Nations, which became the United Nations, right? And note at that time, the US was not even in war. So why was FDR even talking about this or coming up with it? Well, we know that he and the Jews were going to get the US involved in the war, right? That was their ultimate goal, always was their goal. And then it says on the middle arrow there, it says number one, each government pledges itself to employ its full resources, military or economic, against those members of the tripartite pact and its adherence with such government is at war, which such government is at war. And the tripartite act, right? That pact that was Germany, Italy, and Japan and their allies. And in the bottom, it says the foregoing declaration may be adhered to by other nations which are, or which may be, rendering material assistance and contributions in the struggle for victory over Hitlerism, right? So the entire foundation of the United Nations, which was based on the Declaration of the United Nations, which was founded at the Atlantic Charter by FDR and Churchill, was the struggle for victory over Hitlerism, right? Or the destruction of Germany, Japan, and Italy, right? The destruction of those powers which opposed Jewish world domination. So, yeah, on the top right there, it says, per Wikipedia, the defeat of Hitlerism constituted the overarching objective and represented a common allied perspective that the totalitarian militarist regimes ruling Germany, Italy, and Japan were indistinguishable. The declaration, furthermore, was consistent with the Wilsonian principles of self-determination, thus linking U.S. war aims in both world wars. Really linking the Jewish war aims in both world wars. Um, so yeah. So my note, right? The big four were entirely dominated and controlled by the Jews, and you can see on the on the left there the original signatories, excuse me, of the United Nations Declaration. And it says the dominions of the British Commonwealth were obviously subject to the Jewish-controlled British government. That's the only reason Australia, Canada, New Zealand, and South Africa signed. They were run by the Jews who controlled the British Empire. The independent countries, right in the middle there, with all the South American countries. So the independent countries in the Americas were anything but independent, right? It's like tongue in cheek there, or they're mocking who's ever reading this to think they were independent. But they were subject to Jew controlled US domination. These were basically banana republics. They were satellites of the United States government. And you can see General Smedley Butler's book on that. So, and then note Argentina and Brazil did not sign, right? They are not there. And they were actually somewhat independent and to a point were friendly with Germany. And they were made to bend to the Jews' will later on. The European governments in exile, right on the bottom there, were not legitimate governments and had no authority. They were just a bunch of communist Jews or lackeys that fled their nations and there gave up all control of their nations and legitimacy to control the nations. They were literally nothing. They had no legal authority whatsoever. The people in each respective nation set up their own legitimate governments within their borders when these illegitimate Jew-run governments fled. So the people actually had their own governments under German liberation, right? Because the Germans liberated Belgium, Czechoslovakia, Greece, Luxembourg, Netherlands, Norway, Poland, and Yugoslavia from Jewish Bolshevik domination. The people were finally free. So anyway, yeah, the UN Declaration, this was entirely a Jewish one world government, the New World Order. And it was created to crush the final resistance to the satanic Jewish world domination. Right? That is what Germany, Italy, and Japan were fighting against. That is what Germany and their allies stated they were fighting against. And the Jews who ran the Big Four and the Dominions and the quote unquote independent countries were well aware of that. They knew Germany, Japan, and Italy were fighting for their freedom and to free the world of Jewish domination. So, and like I said, you can watch my video on the term, the New World Order, its origins and development in US media, and you will see who was included and who was not included. And Germany was never included in the quote unquote New World Order. It was entirely satanic and Jewish.